In 2006, when Ethiopia announced it would restore thousands of acres of forest without planting a single tree, the world burst into laughter. A green utopia for the desperate, mocked the Washington Post. They'd be better off just moving to the Sahara, said an official from Brussels. A German environmentalist wrote an article titled, "Why Ethiopia is Mars on Earth." The whole world thought it knew the truth. This was one of the poorest countries on the planet, where only the wind of death could be heard, where over 1,000 people died every day from hunger and related diseases, where the desert was swallowing the last living patches of land like a tank invasion. So what? Are they going to grow trees out of thin air? Experts laughed. Talk to stumps? Maybe they're friends with the sand too? Others joked. CNN showed reports about crazy African plans to bring stones back to life. The BBC made documentaries about how poverty leads to hallucinations. And these people were saying, "We will grow a forest by talking to dead stumps." It seemed like they had lost the last bit of reason out of pure despair. But 10 years later, the same world was left in silent shock. Because in the place where NASA satellites had once seen nothing but a brown wound of death, a real forest had grown. Green, alive, breathing, a forest that no one had planted. This isn't a story about survival. This is a story about resurrection. A long time ago, Ethiopia was paradise on earth. Not as a metaphor, literally. The ancients called it the Garden of Eden, and they had good reasons. Imagine, 2/3 of the country, an area bigger than France, was covered in forests thicker than the Amazon jungle. Roman legionnaires wrote home about mountains, green all the way up to the clouds. Travelers told stories of forests so dense that even the midday sun couldn't reach the ground. Lions roared in the thickets at nearly 10,000 feet above sea level. Places where now only rocks and bones remain. Herds of elephants made paths through giant baobabs that were thousands of years old. Honey-tasting waterfalls fell from heights taller than skyscrapers, their roar carrying for dozens of miles. Leopards hunted in the branches of trees older than Roman aqueducts. Women didn't know what drought was. Springs flowed from every crack in the rocks all year round. Children splashed in streams that never dried up, catching fish with their hands in clear pools. Old men sat in the shade of trees older than the pyramids and told stories under the symphony of 1,000 bird voices. Bees built hives the size of houses, but little by little, paradise began to die at the hands of people themselves. The disaster came like an avalanche in slow motion. Slow, but unstoppable. First, they cut down trees along the roads because they were easier to transport. Then they moved on to the mountain slopes, then to the sacred groves which their ancestors had protected like their own eyes, where they buried chiefs and prayed to the spirits of the dead. Every morning, the mountains woke up to the howl of chainsaws. Thousands of people came out with axes, as if going to war against nature itself. Patriarch trees, 500 years old, fell within hours. The earth trembled like during an earthquake. Trucks loaded with giant logs formed endless funeral processions to the cities, where the wood was turned into furniture for the rich. In a single generation, the forest that had seen the time of the Queen of Sheba disappeared. By the middle of the 20th century, Ethiopia had lost half its greenery. By 1982, only 3% of the country's forest cover remained. That's even less than in the Sahara. Without trees, the land turned into a sieve. Rain, instead of feeding roots, flowed away in torrents, washing the last bits of fertile soil into the ocean. Rivers that had flowed since the time of the dinosaurs became dry stone scars in just 10 years. The wind lifted clouds of dust that could be seen from space. Ethiopia became a terrible brown wound on the green map of Africa. Temperatures rose by 5 degrees Fahrenheit. The rainy season shrank from 6 months to just 1. Lakes that had existed for millions of years began to dry up, leaving behind only salty wastelands. Animals ran away or died painful deaths. Birds stopped returning in spring. The great silence came, a terrible dead silence where the orchestra of life used to play. The world remembered Ethiopia through images of horror that burned into the eyes of the planet. The 1980s. Children like skeletons with eyes as big as saucers, showing only emptiness. Mothers turned into walking shadows, rocking in their arms babies that looked like baby birds. lines for grain stretching for miles under the scorching sun of dead land. Mothers carried dead babies for hundreds of miles just to bury them in the soil that had given them life. Entire villages turned into ghost towns in a matter of weeks. People simply left and never came back. Farmers found their cows mummified near dry wells, their bones turning white in the sun like a chilling warning. At the peak of the famine, the land was taking up to several thousand human lives every single day. In just 3 years, the terrible hunger wiped out a population the size of Munich. International journalists flew in to film the African hell, then returned to their comfortable studios to show this horror to the whole world. But this disaster wasn't just an accident. It was a sentence handed down by the planet itself after decades of destruction. The insane deforestation had turned the country into a desert lunar landscape. Ethiopia was losing 1 billion tons of fertile soil every year, more than the weight of the entire Netherlands. Winds scattered it across the globe, from the Amazon rainforest to the glaciers of Antarctica, like the ashes of a dead green paradise. The fragile balance of the ecosystem collapsed like a house of cards. Rain stopped falling where it had watered the land for thousands of years. Streams turned into cracks in the ground, gaping like wounds. Crops wilted before they could ripen. Farmers whose families had lived off that land for centuries were now harvesting enough grain for only 1 month instead of a whole year. The desert advanced with the speed of a military blitzkrieg, 125,000 acres per year. In the highlands where treetops once whispered in the wind, now only sandstorms howled. Farmers abandoned the ruined fields of their grandfathers, leaving behind only the graves of their ancestors. Livestock died of thirst, their heads resting in the cracked clay of what were once ponds. The government began evacuating entire provinces. Roads were filled with caravans of refugees, almost living corpses, walking into nowhere with bundles on their shoulders. International experts gave a harsh verdict. By the year 2000, Ethiopia would become an uninhabitable desert. It seemed this land had forever forgotten what it meant to be alive. The first rescue attempts failed on a scale that could only be called cosmic. Billions of dollars in international aid literally disappeared into the sand. Kind-hearted Europeans brought in saplings from their greenhouses, but they turned black and died within a week under the African sun. They built dams from the best concrete, but the first rains washed them away. They dug wells with German precision, but they dried up in a month. Armies of experts from the best universities in the world arrived in white jeeps, studied everything, and delivered a clear judgment. The land was dead forever. One professor from Heidelberg even wrote a paper titled, "Why Ethiopia is Mars on Earth," and received a major science award for it. So when the Ethiopian authorities announced in 2006 their unbelievable plan to restore forests without planting a single tree, the world reacted as if they'd claimed they would fly to the moon in a hot air balloon. A green utopia for desperate minds, wrote the Washington Post. An African fantasy on the edge of madness, echoed The Guardian. What, are they going to sing lullabies to the sand? Joked a French scientist at a Sorbonne conference. CNN aired segments about crazy plans to revive stones through prayer. The BBC filmed documentaries about how extreme poverty leads to hallucinations. They think they can talk to dead stumps, sneered scholars in tweed jackets. The world believed one simple truth: nothing ever grows in a desert, period. But luckily, the earth turned out to be wiser than people. In 1983, in the scorched desert of distant Niger, a discovery was made that changed everything. Tony Ronaldo, an Australian agronomist, was a young idealist determined to stop the desert from swallowing the vast Sahel, the dry zone between the Sahara and the African savannas. He came to Africa like a knight on a white horse, ready to fight the ruthless desert almost single-handedly. For years, he planted trees with the persistence of a fanatic. His organization spent millions on saplings, fertilizers, and irrigation systems. Every year, they planted 6,000 trees. Every year, 5,500 of them died. The local people called him the crazy white farmer. Children giggled as they watched him watering dead sticks in 130 degrees Fahrenheit heat, talking to them like they were children. The desert was cruel and mocking. Hurricane winds ripped saplings out like matchsticks. The sun scorched them in a day. Sand buried them overnight. And then one day, while changing a flat tire on a dusty road in the heart of the drought, when even scorpions hid in their deep burrows, Tony noticed something strange. At the side of the road grew what he thought was a weed. Leaning closer from professional curiosity, he was stunned. It was the stump of an old tree, alive with roots desperately trying to grow. Dozens of tiny green shoots were emerging from what seemed like a dead trunk, like the fingers of someone drowning reaching for light, like a cry for help echoing through time. In that moment, a switch flipped in Tony's mind. He realized he had been solving the wrong problem for years. It wasn't about planting new trees. It was about finding a way to wake the old ones up. Under layers of sand and dust, the root systems of trees cut down decades earlier were still alive. They reached more than 100 feet deep, down to underground water where the drought couldn't reach. They were waiting. They remembered how to be a forest. They were sleeping, but not completely dead. That's how the FMNR technique was born, farmer-managed natural regeneration. The secret was laughably simple. When a stump puts out dozens of weak shoots, you leave only 3 to 4 of the strongest. All the energy of the ancient root system goes into those few, instead of being wasted on many weak shoots. The result? A shoot grows a few inches per month. In a year, a small tree at human height. In 3 years, a full canopy. Since 1983, a similar experiment in Niger with 10 farmers slowly gained momentum. By the early 2000s, the method had spread to hundreds of thousands of acres, a respectable outcome for the dry Sahel. Tree density rose from 2 per acre to 8 per acre. Millet and sorghum yields increased by almost 20%. Shrubs, young trees, and livestock feed appeared. Locals were pleased. Children stopped going hungry in the dry season, and women spent less time collecting firewood. But that was only a drop in the Sahel Ocean. By 2005, the U.S. Geological Survey recorded vegetation recovery on roughly 7.5 million acres. An impressive number, but only a tiny fraction of the Sahel's 500 million acre area. Most experts saw the Niger success as local, not scalable. Tony Ronaldo and his team understood the harsh reality. The relatively mild climate of Niger, with its 20 inches of rain per year, was very different from drought-baked Ethiopia, where for 8 to 10 months no rain fell at all. In Niger, there was at least occasional drizzle to keep soil moist. In Ethiopia, the earth was as hard as asphalt and temperatures often hit 50 degrees Celsius. Humidity fell below 10%. Winds blew with hurricane force, drying out any growth in hours. Despite everything, Ethiopia decided to test the crazy Niger idea at national scale. The world laughed. If Niger restored only tiny percentages of its desert in 23 years, what will they do in Ethiopia's hell? Wrote Nature. The climate difference is colossal. It's like comparing a greenhouse to the surface of Mars, stated climate scientists from MIT. In Niger, there is at least a rainy season. In Ethiopia, there is only a season of death, mocked a French ecologist at a Paris conference. Soon rumors reached Humbo, a region stricken by famine for 30 years, about the crazy white farmer from Niger and his magical method. 7 communities decided to try Tony Ronaldo's idea. They had no choice, only a terrible, hungry death or a miracle. Humbo was called a lunar landscape. The hills were as bare as a newborn skull. Not a single tree was on the horizon, only rock and dust up to the sky. The soil had turned to concrete. It could be chopped with an axe. Children did not know what shade was, except from their own fragile huts. Women walked 15 miles a day for water, returning under the stars when the daytime heat faded. People accepted FMNR in desperation, like prisoners waiting for execution. They fenced off the deadest patches with barbed wire. They stopped cutting what looked like weeds. They began trimming weak shoots with sharp knives, nurturing the strong ones like their own children. They protected the young growth from goats and livestock that ate every green leaf. And they waited, praying to all their gods. In the first weeks, nothing happened. The land was silent. Many began to doubt. Maybe the experts were right, and they really had gone mad? But the elders insisted patience was needed. The land has been asleep for 30 years. Give it time to wake up, they said. And then after 3 months, a miracle happened. The first results appeared like a gift from the heavens. Tiny green dots on the brown canvas of death, like stars in a night sky. Children ran from one bush to another, counting every new sprout. Women cried with joy, kissing the first leaves. After 6 months, bushes up to the waist. After a year, young saplings rustled in the wind. After 3 years, people no longer recognized their land. Where there had been only desert, young trees were growing green and strong. NASA recorded a real phenomenon from space, a green patch expanding in the middle of the desert at a rate of 25 acres per month. Scientists checked the data again and again. They had never seen anything like it. Satellites don't lie. By 2020, the Humbo forest had absorbed nearly 3 million tons of carbon dioxide. That's more than a small European country emits in a whole year. The project became the first in Africa to sell carbon credits on the international market. The communities earned $500,000 from it, more money than they had seen in their entire history. Crop yields skyrocketed. Farmers who used to harvest 3 sacks of grain from a field were now harvesting 15 from the same land. New sources of income appeared. Wild honey from bees that had returned from nowhere, medicinal herbs, building materials, and livestock feed. People who had spent their whole lives struggling just to survive began planning a future for their children for the first time. But the most unbelievable thing happened with the water. In the mountains around Humbo, there were once 13 springs. All of them dried up in the 1980s. The elders remembered them as places of childhood games and women's conversations, where girls learned to braid hair and boys caught frogs. But for 30 years, they were just dusty pits overgrown with thorns. Geologists had made their conclusion. The water was gone forever, the aquifers depleted beyond recovery. But the trees knew better than the geologists. As FMNR worked its magic, something incredible was happening underground. The soil beneath the new canopies turned into a sponge. Rain no longer ran off in streams, washing away the last bits of fertility into distant seas. It began to soak in, to seep down deeper and deeper, quietly bringing the sleeping aquifers back to life. And then the springs began to return. At first, tiny trickles after rain, vanishing within an hour. Then they flowed longer. Then they flowed for a whole day. Then a week. Then they didn't stop, even during the harshest dry season. The water was cold and clear, like the tears of joy from the land itself. Today, 6 of the 13 springs flow all year round with the force of geysers. Their murmuring can be heard from half a mile away. It's the true song of a resurrected land. Children who had never seen flowing water now splash in streams, learning to swim in pools. Women who used to walk half a day along rocky trails for water now fill their buckets 5 minutes from home. No one dug wells, no one installed pumps, no one laid pipes. People simply gave nature a chance to remember how to be alive. 10 years later, the BBC returned to Humbo to film a follow-up. The crew got lost on the very first day. The cameraman looked around in confusion. The place he remembered as a lunar crater had become a real jungle. The GPS showed the right coordinates, but their eyes refused to believe what they were seeing. Where once the view stretched endlessly across a bare ground, now you couldn't see more than 30 feet ahead because of thick greenery. Instead of the whistle of wind among rocks, there was a symphony of birds and the rustling of leaves. Children born after the project began don't believe their parents' stories about the desert. They know only the shade of trees, the songs of birds, the murmur of streams. When they are shown old photographs, they think it's footage from Mars. How could people live in such a hell, they ask, amazed? Experts are quietly rewriting textbooks. Universities that once mocked FMNR as shamanism are creating departments of natural regeneration. Professors from Harvard and Oxford now line up to study these primitive methods from African farmers. The story of Humbo spread across Africa like a virus of hope. FMNR began to spread faster than an epidemic. In West Africa, already 37 million acres of restored land. In Mali, 70% of families no longer know what hunger is. In Kenya, incomes have risen by 40%. In Senegal, children are seeing antelopes for the first time in years. The cost of the method is unbelievably low. $15 per acre compared to over $7,000 per acre for traditional reforestation. Survival rate, 90% versus 20% for imported seedlings. Chinese scientists come to study the African magic and adapt it for the deserts of Gansu. Indians are testing this unique approach in Rajasthan. Mexicans in Sonora. Brazilians are restoring the Cerrado. Australian Aboriginal communities are reviving their bushland after fires using ancestral knowledge. The World Economic Forum has launched the Trillion Trees program. The UN has declared 2021 to 2030 the decade on ecosystem restoration. FMMNR is now a key technology for saving the planet. Tony Ronaldo received the Alternative Nobel Prize. In Davos, people listen to him like a prophet. His book, The Forest Underground, has been translated into 20 languages. The man once called the crazy farmer is now known as the man who whispers to trees. NASA confirmed the sensation. Despite the devastating deforestation of the Amazon, the Earth's total green cover is growing, and Africa is leading the way in this miracle. In 15 years, Ethiopia restored forest cover over an area larger than Belgium. A country that once lost millions of acres a year now restores over 1 million acres annually. It is the fastest ecosystem recovery in history. The climate of the region is changing before people's eyes. The rainy season has grown from 2 months to 4. Temperatures have dropped by 4 degrees Fahrenheit. Humidity has increased by 1/3. Birds that hadn't been seen in 50 years are returning. Eagles, storks, sunbirds. Fatima from Humbo now exports honey to Europe. 2 tons a year from plants her grandmother believed were extinct. The bees believed in the forest's rebirth before people did, she says with a smile, showing jars of golden honey. Demesu gives tours to delegations from 40 countries and shows the stump where it all began. A gnarled remnant of a tree his grandfather cut down in the 1960s has now become a giant with a canopy big enough to shelter 100 people. My grandfather killed the tree, I brought it back to life, and my grandson will eat its fruits, he tells every group. 89-year-old Elder Abebe sits each morning under the tree he helped grow, crying tears of happiness. I thought I would die without seeing the green hills of my childhood again, but the earth was more patient and wiser than we were. Today, as the planet burns in the fire of climate disaster and experts warn of irreversible processes, Ethiopia's incredible revival sounds like an anthem of hope. If one of the poorest countries in the world could bring dead land back to life with bare hands, what could all of us do together? This method is now spreading across 27 countries, from Kenya and Mali to India, Australia and Mexico, from Laos to Argentina. The seeds of an idea sown in the dust of an African village are now growing on every continent. 30 years from now, children will play in these forests. Children who won't believe there was ever a desert here. And when they see photos from 2006, they'll ask, why did you wait so long to begin? Ethiopia didn't plant a single tree, but it grew hope for the whole planet. It proved a simple truth. Beneath every desert sleeps a forest, waiting for someone to help it wake up. And if you ever doubt the power of human belief, remember this story. Remember the people who didn't give up when the whole world laughed at them. Remember the land that remembered how to be alive and waited for someone who would believe in miracles. Now look out your window. Maybe there's a forest sleeping under your own ground, waiting only for your faith. If poor Ethiopia could bring its land back to life with bare hands, what's stopping each of us from saving at least our yard, our street, our country?